Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. God bless you, and thanks for being with me today. And if you've been with me the past couple weeks, you know that I'm in the middle of a little series that I've entitled Tony's Listening and Validation Pledge to Sherry. And I've been sharing with you guys this listening and validation pledge that I put together for my wife because the two of us have been doing some counseling together, working on some issues, trying to be healthier together, trying to process some things together and work through some things that have been a little bit difficult. And in the midst of that, my wife shared with me that she feels that I don't listen to her well and that I don't validate her. So I've been trying to understand what that means and what would it look like for me to listen better and to validate better. So I began to do some research on what is validation, and as I studied this, one of the things I learned is that validation is much easier said than done. And I think a reason for that is because when two different people look at the same issue, the same topic, the same situation, they often feel very, very differently about it. I might look at the situation and come to a conclusion, that's ABC. But my wife looks at the very same situation and she comes to a completely different conclusion, and she says, that's XYZ. So we feel different, we think different, we see it different, we want different things, we experience it differently. And therefore, how do you validate another person's position, their thoughts and feelings, when you totally disagree with the way that they're seeing it? Because you see ABC, and they're trying to explain to you why that's XYZ. But you're supposed to listen to them and validate them because they think it's XYZ, but you disagree with them because you think it's ABC. So let me give you an absurd example. Let's say that one day my wife is standing at the kitchen window looking into the backyard, and she says, Tony, come here, look at this. There's a dog in the backyard. So I come over to the window, I stand next to her, and I look out the window, and of all things, there's a turkey in the backyard. I very clearly see a turkey. It has two legs, and it's this big black thing, and it's got a long neck with a red head, and there's two wings on the side and a tail in the back. So I quite clearly see a turkey, and my wife says to me, look at that dog. Can you believe there's a dog in our backyard? And I'm thinking to myself, really? You see a dog? That's a dog? That's what you think you see? So as we discuss this situation, I am called upon to listen to my wife and to validate my wife. This means that I'm going to make room for her subjective reality. So I'm going to try to listen to her and understand her point of view, and I'm called upon to essentially say, my love, I'm not sure that I see a dog. It doesn't look like a dog to me, but I want you to know that I'm willing to listen to you. I want to try to understand. Can you help me understand? How do you see a dog right now? What is it that you're seeing? So I'm called upon to listen to her, to be sincere, to be attentive, to be non-judgmental, and to validate her, to try to recognize her thoughts, her viewpoint, her feelings about the situation. And that's easier said than done, because when I quite clearly look out the window and see a turkey, my intuition is to immediately invalidate her, to basically say, dude, you're wrong. What are you talking about? You're crazy. That's not a dog. That's a turkey. I'm sorry you feel that way. I don't think you should feel that way. I completely disagree with you. I think you're wrong. I can't believe that that's what you think. You think you're seeing a dog, and quite clearly you're wrong because that's a turkey. So my instinct and intuition is to immediately begin to explain to her why she's wrong, explain why she shouldn't see what she sees, she shouldn't think what she thinks, she shouldn't feel what she feels. And when I go into that mode, I'm basically not validating her. So how do you validate a person that you're in disagreement with? You want to make room for them. You want to understand them. You want to listen to them. You want to be kind. But underneath all that, you disagree. So that creates a tension, I think, that's very difficult for people. So I quite freely acknowledge that I need a lot of work on this, my validation skills. I want to be good at validating. I want to be good at listening. And I think my wife has a legitimate point when she says that I need to work on this. And that's why I put together this pledge, Tony's listening and validation pledge to Sherry. And I began to share this with you last week, and I covered the first 13 points of my pledge. There's 23 points altogether, and I encourage you to go back. I'm not going to read all 13 points in the way of review, but they're there if you want to go back to last week's episode. And so I'm going to continue with point 14 of the pledge today, and point 14 is this: I, Tony, will be careful to use I language when I talk with Sherry, and not you language. I understand that I language will help me to communicate to Sherry what's going on within my own heart, thoughts, and feelings, and that you language will go a long way toward alienating Sherry, making her feel attacked, and making her feel self-defensive. So basically, you guys, I language gives you the opportunity to take responsibility for yourself. And that's all I can do. I can represent myself. I can take responsibility for myself. If I use you language, in other words, you this, and you that, and you said this, and you that, and you this. You language makes the other person feel attacked. It makes them feel blamed. It makes them feel accused. And it's going to cause them to be self-defensive. So instead of using you language, I'm going to attempt to use I language so that I'm taking responsibility for myself and I'm representing myself as accurately as I can, my own thoughts and feelings and viewpoint. So I can say, babe, let me just share with you the best that I can, what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling. And what I see is this. And the reason that I see that, the reason I think this or feel this is because of this, X, Y, and Z. And I think this and I feel that. And this is the way that I experienced it. So now I'm representing myself. I'm not attacking my wife. I'm not blaming her or accusing her. I'm not pointing my finger in her face and wagging my finger and saying, you. Instead, I'm just called upon to take responsibility for myself. So I language is much more helpful. It's much more healthy. It's much more conducive to successful communication and successful relationship. And with that being said, it brings me to point 15 of the pledge, which is this: I, Tony, will always accept and respect when Sherry is feeling overwhelmed, flooded, exasperated, or tired and needs to take a break from the talk that we're having. In addition, I will always notify Sherry if I myself feel the need to take a break during a talk. I recognize that either one of us may need a timeout at any particular point. and that we can always attempt to continue a conversation at another time if either one of us needs to take such a break. And I would just recommend you guys that this is a very useful and significant tool in the context of relationship, the opportunity to take a time out. It's very possible that either partner can get flooded or overwhelmed or feel confused or exasperated, and they just need a time out. And I know that sometimes folks tend to talk too long. I am a counselor and I work with folks, and I am aware of situations where people get into these intense talks for real, and one of the partners begins to get wore out, and the other partner is forging ahead with strength and conviction, and they can literally talk for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 hours into the night. It's 11 o'clock now. It's 12 o'clock. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. Dude, I've got to get up tomorrow morning and go to work. At some point, it's appropriate to take a time out to say, I need a break. I'm feeling overwhelmed. Can we please stop this discussion and we'll continue it tomorrow or at another time? So I'm just acknowledging to Sherry that I will always attempt to accept and respect if she's feeling overwhelmed or flooded and she needs to take a break. And let me just say that in the context of our relationship, almost without exception, I personally don't need this option. I included it in deference to and respect of my wife, because whenever we stop talking, if somebody hits the pause button, the stop button, the eject button, almost invariably it's Sherry. I'm willing to continue to talk because I have the gift of words, right? I'm articulate and I can continue talking. And it's not really hard for me, but sometimes she feels overwhelmed or exasperated. And more often than not, when we terminate a discussion, it's because Sherry hits the pause button. But I need to respect that, because if I insist on pushing forward and continuing to talk and continuing to press my points and my viewpoint and what I think and what I feel, that's when Sherry goes into the mode of circling the wagons. It's too much. It's overwhelming. So I need to respect my wife. I need to understand that. And I need to be willing to back off and hit the pause button when and if it's best, and if she feels the need to hit the pause button. And that brings us to point 16, which is this. I, Tony, recognize that there will not always be a sense of resolution at the end of every conversation. Sometimes there might be resolution, but sometimes there might not be resolution. This implies that the goal of any particular conversation is not necessarily to resolve or fix the issue, but to communicate clearly with one another regarding the issue. Dr. Dan Allender says that most issues of conflict between a couple are irreconcilable 85% of the time. This means the goal of any given conversation is not necessarily for Sherry and I to resolve the issue, but rather to communicate about the issue. And I just think that this is an incredibly important principle, you guys, to recognize that resolution is not always possible. Dr. Allender says that 85% of the time, couples cannot resolve their issue. If I'm looking at this issue and I see ABC, that's what I see. I'm looking out the window, dude, I see a turkey. That is a turkey. But my wife sees a dog. It's not like I can explain to her my thoughts and viewpoint, but that has 2 legs and it's got a long neck. And I'm explaining, and therefore my wife throws her hands up in the air and a light bulb goes off above her head and she says, "Oh, now I see, Tony, that's what you think. That's what you feel. Oh, you've persuaded me. Now I agree with you. That's what I see because that's what you see. And that's what I think because you've explained to me what you think. It doesn't work that way. People don't always agree with one another. They see it different. There is no resolution. So if you demand resolution every single time you talk, we've got to work this through to an agreement, to a resolution, then, dude, you're going to be up all night talking because resolution is not always possible. So we're recognizing that resolution is not necessarily the goal of every conflict or discussion or conversation because it's not always possible. Our goal is to communicate. Our goal is to listen to each other, to try to understand each other, and to validate one another, even if we happen to disagree. And that brings us to point number 17, which is this. I, Tony, pledge that when and if there's a time that Sherry and I are unable to agree on or resolve any particular issue or situation, that we can still agree to disagree, and that I will attempt to do so in a loving way that will always respect Sherry's dignity and personhood and is defined by grace. And I think maybe a way to say this is, dude, you better be able to be okay with not being okay in your relationship sometimes, because you're not always going to agree, you're not always going to see things the same way, and therefore you feel disrupted, you feel upset, you disagree with your wife, and you have to somehow learn to be okay with not being okay, because you can't force your viewpoint down her throat. You can't make her agree with you. You can't make her see it the way you see it, and she can't make you see it the way she sees it. So sometimes there's going to be situations and issues that are not resolved. And you've got to learn to accept the other person, to be at peace with them, to understand that we see this different, and we agree to disagree. There isn't a resolution here, but I'm still married to you, and I still love you, and I still am committed to you, and I still accept you, and we don't agree on this issue, and we're just going to have to be okay with the fact that we don't agree. And that brings us to point 18, which is this. I, Tony, pledge that I will always make room for Sherry within the context of our relationship, and that I will always attempt to move toward Sherry within our relationship. This means that I will always attempt to avoid counterproductive and immature responses such as criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Point 19 is this. I, Tony, will always attempt to take responsibility for myself in every way, and when it's appropriate, I will always attempt to humble myself before Sherry, to acknowledge when I have done something wrong, when I have hurt Sherry's feelings, or when I have sinned against Sherry. In any such situation, I will always attempt to tell Sherry that I'm sorry and to ask for her forgiveness. And let me just say, you guys, that this is something that I've had to do over and over and over and over and over again in the context of my marriage and my relationship. Taking responsibility for myself when I realized that I am out of line. I got ignorant, I was unkind, I was insensitive, I was mean, I was cruel, I wasn't listening well, I was immature, I did something inappropriate, I rolled my eyes, I was sarcastic, or I was critical, or whatever stupid thing that Tony does, and I'm pretty good at doing stupid things. So I have hurt my wife over and over again. I've been unkind. I've provoked her with a relational slap when Jesus said, if somebody slaps you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. So I'm pretty good at slapping my wife, metaphorically, with these relational offenses. And I don't think it's that I'm malicious, although I think in the context of our 37-year marriage, there have been times when I've been malicious and with deliberate intention. I've actually wanted to hurt my wife because I felt angry, or I felt justified, or I felt hurt, and I would lash out. And I know that what I'm about to say or do is going to be hurtful to her, but I do it anyway. So sometimes there is malice. And I think this is a dynamic that my favorite author, Dr. David Snarch, refers to as normal marital sadism. So sometimes we are unkind to each other, and when you realize that you've been unkind, that you're out of line, that something you've done or said is inappropriate, dude, you better have the ability to suck it up, to humble yourself before God and before your wife, and to take responsibility for what you've done, and to say, I'm sorry, and to ask for forgiveness. And that's what I'm trying to articulate in point 19 of the pledge. And with that said, it brings me to point 20, which is this. I, Tony, will always be willing to pray with Sherry either before, during, or after any particular conversation that we happen to be having. By this willingness to pray together, we will always acknowledge God, and our need for God is the very center of our hearts, lives, marriage, and home. And let me just say, guys, that I think that I'm pretty good on this one. I think it's incredibly important that couples pray together. I would ask you, do you pray with your wife? Do you ever pray? And if you don't, I would advocate that you begin to pray with your spouse. And I know that it might be weird at first, it might be uncomfortable, you've never prayed out loud, you don't know how to pray. But dude, let me just say that you can do this. It's not that hard. It's not rocket science. Little kids can pray. And God says that we need to be like little children before Him. So what is prayer? You just speak your heart. You speak your mind to God. You tell God what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what you're struggling with, what you're asking of Him. You ask God for His help, His strength, His guidance, His wisdom in the situation. So humble yourself enough to pray with your wife. Are you willing to pray? And quite frequently, when my wife and I have a conversation, if it's difficult, there's tension, there's disagreement, I don't always feel like praying, believe me, because I feel disrupted. I might feel upset in the moment, but I know that it's the right thing to do. So I will quite frequently ask my wife at the end of a session that we've had this discussion, should we say a prayer? Would you like to say a prayer? And almost invariably, my wife agrees. She says yes. And just as invariably, she does not want to pray, but she gives me permission to pray. So I'll say a little prayer, and I'll end our conversation with God. And maybe I'll pray, God, you see us in this moment. This has been a difficult discussion. Sherry and I don't feel the same. We see this different. We think different. And I know there's some tension here, God. So we just acknowledge our need for you, Lord. I pray that you would help us in our marriage, God. Help us to listen to each other. Help us to talk to each other. Help us to communicate with one another. Help us to be kind to one another. We just ask for your mercies in this situation, God. We lay this at your feet. We ask for the blood of Jesus over this. We pray, oh God, that you would be our helper. And such as that. So just cry out to God in prayer. Bring it to God in prayer. And I think that's quite a beautiful way to end a discussion, especially if it's been difficult, if there's disagreement, and people's feelings are hurt, or there's disruption, whatever's going on. It's always appropriate to pray. And that's what I'm after in pledge number 20, point 20 of the pledge, that I will always be willing to pray with Sherry either before, during, or after any particular conversation that we might happen to have. And that brings us to point 21 of the pledge, which is this. I, Tony, will always seek to honor, esteem, and respect Sherry as reflected in the following 3 passages of the Bible. And I chose these 3 passages as an example of said honor, esteem, and respect that I will always attempt to offer my wife. The first one is Ephesians 5:21. I know I've talked about this verse in the context of the podcast. I believe that this is the single most important verse in the entire Bible about marriage and about relationship. It's only 9 words. It's very short, and I call it spiritual dynamite because there's an incredible amount of power in these 9 words. And if we could embrace these 9 words, if we could understand them, if we could put them to work in our life, in our heart, in our situation, I believe it would change our marriages. People would not have to get divorced if they could figure out how to get these 9 words in their heart and in their marriage, in their relationship, in their home. And the 9 words are this: submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Ephesians 5:21. So to me, that shows the two-way street. My wife should submit to me, but I should also submit to her because it says submit to one another. So I think it conveys something very powerful, that both people are in a posture of humility to one another and to God, and that they're willing to hear one another, to cooperate with one another, to listen, to communicate, to try to understand, to try to validate. I think this is an incredibly powerful proof text for the overall thing that I'm trying to achieve here with Tony's listening and validation pledge to Sherry. The second verse is Philippians chapter 2, verse 3, and I actually touched on this verse last week in my introduction to the episode. It's Philippians chapter 2, verse 3, which says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, rather in humility value others above yourselves." In other words, it's not just me. It's really you. Instead of focusing on me and promoting what I want and what I think and what I feel, I am in humility going to esteem you as more important than me. And then my third passage is taken from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4 through 7, the very familiar love passage from the Apostle Paul, which is incredibly beautiful and powerful. Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Praise be to God for the reading of His holy word. And guys, I said that I had 23 points to my pledge, and that brings us to point 22, which is this. I, Tony, freely acknowledge that I am a deeply flawed person with many weaknesses and defects of character, although I do promise Sherry that I will sincerely attempt to honor the pledges represented in this document. I also recognize that I may fail to do so at times, or at least to do so with significant imperfection. I therefore pledge to Sherry that when I fail to honor any of the pledges represented in this document, that I will take responsibility for such failure, and I will recommit myself to attend to every one of these pledges to the very best of my ability with the help, strength, and grace of God. So I just wanted to acknowledge to Sherry that I'm really going to try to honor this listening and validation pledge, but if I mess up and I stumble and I fail, that I will admit it, and I will take responsibility, and I will continue in my commitment to honor this pledge. And that brings me to point number 23, which is the final point of the pledge, and it says this: I, Tony, affirm the reality that lives in my heart that Sherry is a precious, wonderful, and beautiful person, and the single most important person and relationship of my life. I therefore pledge that I will always seek to nurture, protect, serve, cherish, honor, respect, and love Sherry as the single most precious gift that God has ever given to me in this life. And let me just say, guys, that I truly mean these words when I wrote these words. It absolutely is the reality of my heart, my mind, my thought, my life. I believe that out of 7 or 8 billion people on planet Earth, that Sherry absolutely 110% is the single most important person and single most important relationship of my life. And therefore, she is precious, she is wonderful, she's beautiful, and I am going to go above and beyond the call of duty to try to be kind to her, to try to love her well, to move toward her, to be friends with her, to connect with her, to pursue her, to listen to her, to communicate with her, to validate her. I want to nurture this relationship. I want to work on this relationship. I want to honor this relationship. I want to invest in this relationship because it is the single most important relationship of my life next to my relationship with God Himself. And that finalizes the 23 points of the pledge. But then at the very end, I wrote this: to you, Sherry, my only true love and darling girl forever, I make these pledges to you this day, and to the best of my ability, I will seek to sincerely honor both you and these pledges every day for the rest of our lives together. And then I put 2 blank lines, and underneath, Tony Ingrassia and the date, and the second one, Sherry Ingrassia and the date. And I actually signed this pledge and dated it and gave a copy to my wife because I wanted her to know that I was serious about this. I mean business about this. I didn't write this pledge lightly. I don't take it lightly. I don't offer it lightly. It is significant to me. My heart is invested in this, and I truly want to honor this pledge and work this pledge and apply this pledge and be aware of this pledge and make it work in our relationship. Tony's listening and validation pledge to Sherry. So with that being said, you guys, I see that we are out of time for today's episode. I'm over time, so I need to wrap this up. I pray that this pledge might be encouraging to you in some way, that maybe it points you in a direction in your relationship. I pray that it sheds some light and might provide some guidance and wisdom on some areas that you could work on to strengthen in your relationship with your spouse, and maybe some work that you have to do. And again, let me just conclude by saying, I think, guys, that we need to be committed to our wife. We need to work incredibly hard on nurturing this relationship, investing in this relationship, and to make this relationship as strong and healthy and as godly as it can possibly be. And we will enjoy a tremendous benefit, because not only will we have an awesome relationship and we'll have a best friend and we'll have a great marriage, but one of the benefits of that successful relationship, which is very significant, is that it creates the relational context, the relational environment, the relational greenhouse that will allow you to grow metaphorical tomatoes in the middle of February in St. Louis, or said another way, you're going to have a better chance to have a healthy, vibrant, significant, satisfying, passionate, erotic, satisfying sexual relationship with your wife because you've got a good relationship. So the sex can be healthy the way God intends for it to be. So with that being said, guys, I'm going to wrap it up. God bless you. Have a great day. Have a great week. Be blessed in Jesus' name, and I'll see you right back here next week for our next episode of the Power of Purity podcast. God bless you.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.